In contrast to a predictive dialer, there is another class of dialers called a power dialer. And it has some slightly different purposes or aspirations. Power dialers, like predictive dialers, are high volume dialers. That means that they make a large number of calls in a very short period of time. But they're low touch dialers, meaning that this isn't the type of dialer that you would typically use when you're dealing with, for example, existing customers. And I could give you some examples, but let's not get too deep into the weeds before we jump into some demos and let you actually see some of our products. But unlike a predictive dialer or a preview dialer that we're going to talk about in a minute, a power dialer typically makes the telephone calls automatically, and the first thing that communicates with the human being that's answered the phone is the dialer itself. So it may give a prompt. So let's give some examples of use cases of power dialer. The most frequently one that you and I would be involved in is appointment reminders. So something like, this is Dr. Smith's office reminding Matthew that he has an appointment tomorrow at 2 o'clock at our West Side Clinic. Press 1 to accept to confirm your appointment, or press 2 to reschedule. That would be the function of a power dialer. And we'll show you a power dialer here in just a couple of seconds. Power dialers are also useful for doing things like collections. Power dialers oftentimes, our dialer does, use text to speech to generate a unique message for each person that it calls. So you could imagine a scenario where you get a telephone call like this. This is a call for Matthew, or this is your local cable company. Your current bill is overdue 28 days. Your current balance is $325. If we don't receive a payment in the next 24 hours, your services will be disconnected. If you've already made a payment, press 1. If you'd like to talk to a billing specialist to make a payment, press 2. So those are the kinds of things that you could use a power dialer for. Another one's emergency notifications. We have a municipality that's using our power dialer in Canada, and this town has an ongoing problem with moose coming through town. And so what they use the dialer for is to call all the shopkeepers and tell them, keep all of your patrons in the buildings and lock your doors because there's a moose coming through town. We'll let you know when the moose has been taken care of, but for now, keep everybody inside. You might use it for a political campaign. In this case, it's playing a message and then hanging out. So it might say something like, I'm the greatest politician in the whole wide world. Tomorrow's election day. Be sure to get out and vote for me. Thank you. Goodbye. Any kind of cold call where you're just trying to crank out as many telephone calls as you can. These aren't people that you're already engaged with. So you've just gotten a list from some list provider, and you don't care if you burn through the list. You're just trying to optimize the agent's productivity. So if you'd be interested in our product, press 1, that kind of thing, right? And then, of course, something like a snow day. The thing that we have to be careful when we're talking about using a power dialer for either emergency notifications or snow day closings for schools is that 3CX, again, is based on simultaneous calls. And in the example of a snow day for a school, I've got hundreds, if not thousands, of parents to call in a very short period of time. And I have to have enough SIP trunks, and I have to have enough simultaneous calls on my 3CX server to make the telephone calls in a very short period of time before people start leaving home and heading to school. so that that gap between when they make the decision that it's a snow day and we're going to delay school opening and the time that we need to get all the calls done before people start leaving, there has to be enough time there, and you have to have enough simultaneous calls. So that's something to be aware of. All right, so let's do a demo of the 3CX Power Dialer. So I should mention that this is a list of our tools. This is a little side panel application that I wrote to make it simple to access all of our applications from a single user interface. So we'll just collapse that guy a little bit so that we have a little more space. And let's go and look at our dialer. So remember, power dialers, typically this is used to make a large volume of telephone calls in a short period of time, and it is typically regarded as a low-touch dialer. I will grudgingly admit, because I'm not a huge fan of predictive dialers, that we are starting to incorporate some predictive type functionalities into our power dialer. But let's start with the easy example of an appointment reminder. Going back into ancient history, I used to have a IT services company. And so we were going to an ophthalmologist's office and putting in new servers and upgrading their workstations and doing various work that went over multiple days. And one of the things that I noticed after the first couple of days is that there was a little lady sitting off in a corner making telephone calls all day long. That's all she did, was make telephone calls, calling patients to remind them of their appointments and getting a confirmation or rescheduling those appointments. And I got to thinking about how much that must cost that practice to have an employee whose sole purpose is dedicated to making appointment reminders. And you think about that. Let's say the employee makes $20,000 a year plus Social Security taxes and those kinds of things, plus sick days and holidays. We're probably talking $30,000, $40,000 a year to pay for that person sitting off in the corner. And I thought, oh, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so we built this dialer. So let's talk a little bit about appointment reminders. How do we decide who we're going to call? Well, we'll show you the import process here in just a moment, but let's pretend that we have a repository of contacts that we need to call. In the example of an ophthalmologist, they'd be patients. So we would import a list of people that are scheduled to have an appointment tomorrow, and we'd give it a list name. So this is just general, straightforward SQL syntax for querying it. And for those of you who don't know SQL, you might be panicking a little bit, going, "Oh, I don't know SQL. How are we going to do this?" Let me give you an assurance that our support team and developers will work with you to build the necessary queries that you need to run your campaign. So you don't need to be a SQL expert. Our support staff will help you in building the necessary queries against the data so that you can do what you want. Typically, once you've got it set up, all you have to do is change the date of this import, and that's the only change you need to do to make the query go. All right, so you give it a query, and you'll notice that I didn't say which fields I needed. I just said, give me all the fields from the contacts database, and it built this grid and displayed the information based on what was returned from the database. And this is important because you don't have to use the Power Dialer database. If your backend CRM practice management software has a SQL interface or a MySQL interface, we can go directly to the CRM and pull these contacts out and build the grid of information here based on your specific needs. And that all happens automatically. You don't really have to do anything special. We've built that into the tool. But because we don't know what the structure of this grid, this table of data is going to be, you need to tell the dialer which of these columns contains the phone number. So if you go down here, I press get data, it goes out to the database, finds some people to match that list, and then I come in here and I select which field is the phone number. So it could be the main phone number, it could be mobile number, it could be whatever field is returned by your query. So you're going to specify the phone number that is going to be used for doing this dialer campaign. Well, what's this email thing here? What do I need an email for in order to do a phone campaign? And what on earth do I need an SMS uh, number for if this is a phone campaign? Well, this should be a clue that this power dialer does a little bit more than just make telephone calls. You can also simultaneously have an email campaign and an SMS text campaign. That's all running at the same time. We'll talk a little bit more about SMS in just a minute. All right, so we've identified who the contacts are that we need to get in contact. What happens when somebody answers the phone? That was the phone call that was generated by the dialer. And because we're doing an appointment reminder, we need to tell them when their appointment is, right? So you come in here, and if you select scripted, we can use text to speech to generate the audio that's played to the person when they answer the phone. Alternatively, you can upload a pre-recorded list, a pre-recorded message that you wanted to play. That's typically more appropriate for a political campaign or moose in town or something like that. But let's look at the scripted one. Now, I think people are starting to clue in that text to speech isn't the horrible robotic voice that it used to be. Anybody that's ever used an Echo Dot or Alexa, that's an Amazon product, you've come to realize that text to speech actually works really, really well. And in fact, we use the same text to speech engine that Amazon uses for their Alexa Echo Dot stuff. So now we're talking about the quality of a text to speech message that is approaching human being quality. So you don't need to worry about quality of that speech. It's something that has gotten really good. I think we have some examples on our website as well. If you want to go to our Power Dialer landing page on our website, there's some examples there. Obviously, I'm not going to even tempt fate to see if my audio is working and that you can hear it. So I'm not going to play it right now, but if you need some examples on our website. All right, so what's these funny bracket things around these things? Well, when you go to variables, it's going to look at that grid of data that was returned by your query, and it's going to make each of the fields that were returned by that query a variable that you can then put into your text to speech. So let's just for fun choose country. So I'm going to copy that guy and I'm going to paste him right in here. Paste. And then I'm going to verify my script. So if I click on verify, what I'm seeing is this is a test of Matthew Orr, and somebody's put a dollar figure inside the country code for whatever the test data had a dollar figure in there. But now you see how this could be used for collections. You can also do dates. If I go over here again and look at the variables, there's an explanation of how you can tell the interpreter that the variable that I've inserted is a date or a time, and then it will treat that differently. So instead of saying 03/04/2020, it's going to say June 23rd, 2020, Tuesday at 2 o'clock, that kind of thing. So you can get fairly sophisticated with generating this information, again, verifying it by doing text to speech, and it found the first record that matched in the list of people that I'm supposed to call, and I happened to be the first person in there, so it inserted my first name, my last name, and my country, but somebody's put a date in the country field. Okay, and then if you want to hear the message, I'm not going to click on this because I don't know what it would do in an environment where I don't have an audio card. Um, but this would play the audio and you can listen to it. And if you decide, oh, you know what, I'd like a little pause between this word and that word, you just put a comma in there. So this gives you a feedback loop that lets you refine the message that you're going to play to the end user. By the way, an interesting side note is that Amazon must have an absolutely gigantic library of proper names because it does a really, really good job of pronouncing people's first and last names. So that's another thing that's kind of nice about leveraging the Amazon text-to-speech engine. All right, so this is how you basically create the message that's customized for each user when the dialer calls them on the phone. Well, we can do the same thing with an email. So you give it a subject name, you go to variables, and I can insert anything in here that I want. So we'll put in first name. So we got country there. I'm going to put first name here so that you can see that I'm not just doing smoke and mirrors. This is real stuff. And then when I verify it, you'll see that it has the dollar amount, which somebody put in the country field, and my first name. Okay? So much the same way you can do email and you can do SMS. Again, same way, go to variables, insert them in here. Now, why do I have a different template for audio, email, and SMS? And the reason is that the amount of data that you can put into a text message, for example, needs to be very concise. And so an email, in contrast, can contain a lot of detailed information. And an audio is somewhere in between, I would guess, is that you'd want it to be fairly concise to limit the amount of time that you're sucking up with your SIP trunk provider, but also nobody wants to listen to a long audio message and they'll hang up if it's too long. So giving you ability to fine tune the messages based on the platform that you're using to convey the information, it's important that you have that ability. But let's talk about one limitation with the SMS feature, and that is that every SIP trunk provider that has SMS enabled trunks has their own API. At least that's been my experience so far, is that none of them use the same API. So if you want to do an SMS campaign, it is likely going to require that we do an integration with your particular SIP trunk carrier. Alternatively, if you have a well-known group of people that you're contacting, let's say it's an emergency notification to your employees, for example, like, hey guys, don't come into the office today, it's a blizzard, just work from home. That kind of message. You can use, at least in the United States, every cell phone carrier has a email to SMS gateway. In other words, you send an email to vtext.com. That is Verizon's email to SMS gateway. So it would be the telephone number at vtext.com. If you send an email to that, Verizon will grab that email, look at the subject line, grab the telephone number, then read the body of the email, convert that to an SMS text message, and then send it to that telephone number. So if it's a well-known, obviously you're not going to know who the carrier is of all of your patients, so it won't work in that scenario. But in a scenario where we're dealing with people that you can reasonably ask them who their carrier is, you can do SMS messages without having to have any special integrations that happen. Okay, so that's kind of the general setup of what it's going to say. We've defined who we're going to call, what's going to happen when they answer. Let's look at the next step. Now, the power dialer has a number of different campaign types. Remember, I told you that we're kind of starting to dabble into the direction of a predictive dialer. That's where things get a little bit crossing over into different categories. So we've been talking about an appointment reminder, but there are other types of dialer campaigns that we can do. For example, play announcement. That's one where there's a moose in town, keep everybody indoors, and it hangs up. Or I'm the best politician in the world, vote for me tomorrow. That would be a play announcement. Transfer call to extension is a scenario where you call somebody on the phone and then you just transfer it to an IVR or to a survey or something like that. Transfer call to agent, this is the one where it's starting to kind of tiptoe over toward the predictive. What this dialer campaign does is you specify monitor this queue in 3CX. See how many agents are in that queue and how many of them are logged in and available and their present status is available and that kind of stuff to determine whether they're really available. And then it will make the appropriate number of telephone calls based on the agents in the queue and available. That way, when it calls somebody on the phone and the contact answers the phone, the call will be immediately transferred to a queue. That queue has no on-hold music, so the contact doesn't hear anything. And because we already know that an agent is available, the agent's going to get one ring and answer that phone. That whole process of calling the contact once they answer to the time that the agent can answer is about a second if the agent is paying attention and ready to grab that phone. Now, if, for example, you're using the 3CX phone for Windows, you can set it to auto answer, in which case that time between when the customer answers the phone and when the agent answers the call is even shorter. So in our testing and feedback that we've gotten from our customers is that it happens so quickly that the customer doesn't even know that the agent just wasn't there. To them, it feels like it's just a human being was there when they said hello. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the agent. Let's start at the top. You specify when the campaign can start and when the campaign can end. You can set these up in advance. So if you know that your call center staff is going to be in at 9 o'clock, you could set this all up at 8 o'clock in the morning and initiate the campaign, and it'll just sit there and wait until it's 9 o'clock. And when 9 o'clock rolls around, then it'll start making these telephone calls. This allows you as an administrator, as a manager of the team, it allows you to get everything set up and ready to roll. So the second that your staff are ready to do it, it just goes. So that's the start time, and this is the end time. Now, obviously, you're going to let this dialer campaign go, but you don't want to be making calls to people at 1 o'clock in the morning. So typically you would say, I don't know, maybe 6 o'clock in the evening is the latest that you'd want to be calling people. So you can set an end time. This could encompass multiple days if you wanted, but I think most frequently people are just talking about a start time and an end time that is within the current day. All right, you select the type of campaign that you want. What is this total max system calls thing and this max dialer calls thing? Well, one of the things we want to be very careful about is overwhelming your 3CX server with dialer calls. you want to reserve some of those telephone calls, those simultaneous calls available on your PBX for customers to call in or for staff to do ad hoc telephone calls. So let's say hypothetically that you have a 32 simultaneous call 3CX license. If I set this total maximum system calls to 26, what that means is that before the dialer makes its next call, it's going to check and see if there are already 26 calls running on the system and active at that time. And if there is, it's going to pause for 2 seconds, and then it's going to check again and say, okay, or has somebody hung up the phone? And so as long as it's underneath that 26 simultaneous call licenses, it'll dial. But once it reaches 26, it's going to say, all right, I got to wait until more call paths are available. All right, well, how's that differ from this one, max dialer calls? You can also specify the maximum number of simultaneous calls that are generated by the dialer. So if I only have 100 people to call and the average call takes about 30 seconds, I can get through that list pretty easily without overwhelming my PBX. So if I make 3 calls at a time, that should be fine. I should be able to get through my entire list that day. So these are just tools for monitoring the activity of the 3CX in the dialer to make sure that it doesn't consume all of the resources of your SIP trunks or your 3CX server. Call only once, don't retry. What this means is that, well, you could look at, maybe it's easier to look at it as the opposite. If I don't check that, it's going to call somebody on the phone, and if the phone was busy, it's going to put that person at the bottom of the list, and when it gets to the bottom of the list, it's going to call them again. So if they're busy, if they don't answer, we're going to call them multiple times, but eventually give up. So that's what this checkbox is for. Now, in the case of an appointment reminder campaign type, there's another limitation that we want to put on the dialer so that it doesn't overrun the 3CX server. In the case of the ophthalmologist that we were working on many years ago, that little lady rescheduling appointments could only handle 1 call at a time. So if I put 100 people in the queue waiting to reschedule their appointment, she would have gotten overwhelmed and people would have got angry because they'd be sitting there waiting in the queue for an hour and 45 minutes waiting for her to become available to reschedule them. So what you can do is you can say, monitor this queue and how many people can be waiting in the queue before I pause the dialer. So this is set to 2. So in other words, if there's already 2 people waiting in the queue wanting to reschedule their appointment, pause the dialer. So 26 simultaneous calls, pause the dialer. 3 calls already active that were generated by the dialer, pause the dialer, don't make more. If there are already 2 people waiting in the queue, pause the dialer. So these are all approaches for trying to not overwhelm the 3CX server or the support staff that are taking those calls when somebody says, I'm not available for an appointment. But is this just good for appointments? Well, the answer is no. What this really is play a message and give me options afterwards. So it could be just as easily, this is your cable company reminding Matthew that his payment is past due 28 days. He owes $350. If you've already made a payment, press 1. That's a lot like confirming an appointment, isn't it? Press 1 if you've already made a payment, or press 2 to talk to a billing specialist to make a payment. Well, that's a lot like transferring somebody to a queue to reschedule their appointment, isn't it? So the idea behind this dialer campaign is really play whatever message you want to play and then give them an option to confirm or to be transferred to a queue where somebody can work with them. So you could also use it another way. I'm your local heating and air conditioning company, and we are running a special this week that will We'll do a free evaluation of your heating air conditioning system. If you, what would be a polite way of saying it? If you're not interested, press 1. If you'd like to schedule a free appointment, press 2. So collections, appointment reminders, um, cold calls, all of these things all kind of fit into that appointment reminder campaign type. All right, so I've got it all set up. I've got all of my criteria, my restrictions on this dialer set up. What do we do next? Come to the run screen. And every time you run a campaign, what it's going to do is it's going to go to the query that you generated under the contacts tab, and it's going to grab all the people that match the criteria you've specified, and it's going to put them into a list, and it's going to give that list a date and time, a run date and time. So I'm going to select one that I did this morning just to make sure that everything was working so I could test it here. And you see it says answered right now. That's because I've already run this campaign. But normally, the first time through, this would be blank, right? So, okay, I'm all ready to go. I've got the list of people that I want to call. I press the start button, and it'll start calling these people. And as the status of that call gets determined, whether it was rang and nobody answered, or it was a bad number, or they answered the phone, those statuses will be updated on this list. And it'll just keep working through the list. Well, let's say lunchtime comes and we all want to take a break because we've been slamming through all of these telephone numbers and we could all use a break. When I press the start button, then the stop button becomes available and I can press the stop button. And that'll pause the dialer. That'll stop it from dialing any more people. And whether I choose to start it up in an hour after lunch or I choose to start it up the next day doesn't really matter. I've got a list of people that I'm supposed to call, and as soon as I press start again, it'll start where it left off and continue on working with this list. And it'll keep going until all of the telephone numbers are gone, or you delete the run altogether, or the start and end time is has been reached. The maximum end time has been reached. So that's kind of how you run a campaign. I should also mention, so while the campaign's running, it's going to show you the total active calls on the system. This is a progress bar, right? And it knows the number of simultaneous call license you have. So it'll show a progress bar. So if you're wondering, well, why did the dialer stop dialing? None of my agents are getting telephone calls right now. You can come and look at the system, and if it shows that it's got 28 simultaneous calls going, you go, oh, well, it stopped dialing because there's too many people on the phone system already. Okay, fine. Or it could be that there are too many people waiting in the queue. So this will show you a progress bar of how many people are waiting in the queue. And I'm not, I think this is actually mislabeled. I think this is the total number of calls that are currently active that were initiated by the dialer. And I should mention to them that they need to rename that label. And then this last one shows you the overall progress. How far have you made it through your list of names that you're supposed to call? And in this particular campaign, I only had 2 people, so that's why the progress bar goes all the way across, is that because it called everybody in the campaign. All right, and of course, then once the campaign's all done, you can export the results in various formats that you can then import into your CRM or practice management software, something like that. All right, so if we go back to, what is it, setup, let's take a look at some of these other campaign types. We're almost done with this, by the way, and we'll move on to the next dialer here in just a second. If I choose play announcement, you'll notice that there's no queue that I can select from here because it just plays an announcement and hangs up. If I choose transfer call to an extension, you'll see here's a list of extensions that I can transfer the call to. So the options that display on this screen um, are specific to the type of campaign that you choose. And then again, if I go to transfer call to agent, now you'll notice that it doesn't say what's the maximum number of people that can be waiting in the queue, because that's irrelevant. What's important is how many agents are available to take the call. So that's why that field isn't there. All right. What else? We never talked about the import screen. Let's look at that real quick. How you get people into the repository that the dialer uses is pretty straightforward. You just browse to a CSV file. I don't have one here, and I could make one real quick and show you, but these webinars tend to go too long anyway. So you browse to the CSV file, you give it a list name, and oftentimes I'll just use a date for the list name. Specify whether the CSV file is a comma separated or tab separated file, and then press Get Fields. And it will read that CSV file, and the requirement is that the first row in the CSV file is the column names. And so it will display those column names in this grid here. And then you just match. First name goes to contact first, last name goes to contact last, and so forth. And once you've mapped the structure of your CSV file to specific fields within the dialer database, you never have to do it again. So if you're always getting the data from the same source, for example, an export from your practice management software, it's always going to have the same format. So you only have to do this mapping step one time. Once that's done, all you do is browse to the CSV file, give it a name, and press import. And it's that simple. So it's click, 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 and you're done. All right, so I think that's the main aspects or features of the Power Dialer. There's more that we could go into for reports and settings. Maybe we could jump in here real quick and look at some settings. You can set up your SMTP server for email campaigns and SMS campaigns. You can set up whether you use Windows text-to-speech engine or Amazon Poly. There's some advanced things that you can do about adding digits or stripping digits from telephone numbers before it makes the dialer. This appointment type is really for a little mini CRM that we've built into this application for allowing you to put campaign appointment types. So if you have no practice management software or CRM, you can use this little built-in CRM, and it's super ultra minimalist. It's just give me a list of people and when their appointments are, that kind of thing. All right, and then reports are just going to show you who was called, what type of campaign was called, when was the call made, those kinds of information. Do we have some data here? I guess I do. Do I? Yeah. So I had a little bit of information here from the campaign that I ran this morning. And again, you can export this information. So you can group them by campaigns. If you want to group them by phone number, I guess, or phone status, which calls were answered and which ones were not. Well, in this case, both of them were answered. So some very simple ways of creating some complex reports with grouping and sorting and filtering and all that stuff. So I could also filter it by the dialed number here. So if I put 80801, it would filter the list of people. As you saw, now it's only showing people with 801. So if you wanted to know specifically when was this telephone dialed, you can go in and put in that telephone number, and you can see what campaign was used, what date and time it was used. So some very simple I should say, straightforward ways of manipulating historical information.